Hi, everyone. Well, I've never dreamed I'd be the opening act for anything, but I know it's going to be a good evening. And I thank Kim for asking me to share my story. I'm the oldest of 4 children, and I grew up in what I'd call a relatively normal, dysfunctional family. Although my mother didn't start drinking until after I left home, she was always kind of angry and critical. But my dad was kind and gentle and patient and reserved, and he just tried to avoid conflict and tried to keep the peace. I started dating my husband on my 18th birthday, and that was just the beginning of our turbulent relationship. He'd had a very sad and horrible childhood, and I used to say it was worse than the soap operas. He had told me when we were dating that he would drive on the wrong side of the road around curves, just hoping somebody would hit him. And I tried to help him. But I didn't even know what I was doing. And at one point, I tried to break up with him, but I couldn't carry through with it because I felt so sorry for him. So I made a decision that I would stay with him and love him. And so we got married when I was 19 and a half. I always had to put that part in. So early in the marriage, he told me that he'd been unfaithful to me while we were engaged, and it just really crushed me. And I was living far away from home, so I was homesick, and I was severely depressed, even to the point of being bedridden at times. Just couldn't get up. But thankfully, some dear Christians shared the gospel with me, and I believed it. And just so much in my life changed at that time, but the marriage didn't. And so I tried to get him to go to church, but that didn't work. And I prayed for him and prayed for our marriage, and I learned out about how to be a submissive wife. I said, oh, good, this is something I can do. But I interpreted it as being a doormat. And I used to tell people after I found out what I'd done that I would let him run over me with a Mack truck and then back up and run over again. So I really just was trying to be submissive, but just took it a little bit in the wrong way. And so I read a lot of Christian books, tried to figure out what to do, but it just never was good. For a while, I was washing lipstick off of his collars and asked him about it. He said he was dancing, and I wanted to believe that so badly because he told me he was going to be faithful. But it was just too painful to really believe what I was seeing, so I just lived in denial. After we'd been married about 8 years, I got pregnant, and I was just so thrilled because I always wanted to be a mother. Initially, my husband talked about abortion, but I think he just really didn't understand that it wasn't a blob of cells, that it really was a person. So, and when she was 6 months old, he told me that he wanted a divorce, and he'd been dating somebody for 5 years, which obviously I was just devastated, and was so fearful of what the future might be with a little child, and I just wouldn't let him go. I just was praying for God to still heal our marriage, please. And finally, because he had been drinking, I didn't mention that part, I had been going to Al-Anon, and that really helped me to see some of the things that I'd done and gain some strength. And I realized that he'd left our marriage many years before, so I had to let him go. I couldn't change him, and I couldn't make it work just by myself. So we divorced after being married 10 years. My daughter was 2. And the next couple of years were just a really precious time for me. With the Lord was my husband, my maker, my husband. I had a good job. I was active in my church, and I was singing with the worship team, and even had an opportunity to minister to a couple of ladies who were in abusive marriages. Things weren't always, rosy, but I was just so much more peaceful and content and happy. And I prayed that I'd be able to marry one day again a godly, kind man. So my daughter and I moved to Charlotte in 1984 to be closer to my family, and my sister and her husband had told me about this guy in their church and how great he was. And so I met him, and we'd spent some time together, and it seemed like the Lord was bringing us together to be married. Our pastor even told us that God told him that he had brought me to Charlotte to marry him, But he said, y'all, I got to get married right away for your daughter's sake, which I now know is very poor advice. So we got married after being together for 2 whole months. I had thought that he was a wonderful, godly man, but obviously you can't tell much in 2 months. He does have a lot of good qualities, and he made me laugh. But what I didn't see was his anger, his aggression, and his controlling tendencies. So soon he began to criticize me just about everything I did because I did it wrong. I didn't do it the right way because it wasn't his way. Like even cutting green peppers. And I just had to, I tried to be strong in myself. So, I hadn't had any trouble. No one's complained about my green peppers. So I see no reason why I can't just keep doing it like this. But he would not let it rest. And I finally had to just do what he said to keep the peace, is what it felt like anyway. But, and he actually, even at one point, suggested that I needed to change my accent because it was too southern, but at least I didn't know how to do that. I was 32, how do you change your accent? So, I realized in our whole marriage that he really just was not able to accept me for who I was. I wasn't perfect. Big surprise, but. And even though I didn't know about the word abuse, I felt like he was just cruel. And he would make fun of me, he would yell at me and the children, and he played this practical joke on me one time that everybody was laughing, and I kind of laughed along, but I thought, this doesn't feel funny to me. It just wasn't funny. And so within 6 months of getting married, I told my sister that he was just like my first husband. And by that time, I was expecting our twin sons. Then he started drinking excessively, and so I went back to Al-Anon and some counselors, and I was just desperate to and I didn't want another divorce. And therapists told me that I could leave, which hadn't entered my mind at all. I considered it, but I just really felt like God didn't want me to leave. But I think now I was probably just afraid with 3 young children. So I made that choice, and then I stopped going to 3 minutes. Uh-oh. Sorry. The therapist told me that I could leave, and I didn't want to leave, so I was trying to submit to him and being a good Christian wife, but I couldn't speak the truth in love to him. I was just too afraid of his angry words. And we had a 3rd child, and we did have some good times, and he was he's always been faithful and hardworking and a good provider. But we were all afraid of him. We just walked around in eggshells, just trying not to make him get angry. And thankfully, he traveled out of the country a lot, and that was a great relief for me. I used to think he was my only enemy because no one else treated me like that. And I came to realize that he saw me as his enemy, but I didn't really give him any reason to feel that way. 2 years ago, my older daughter and her family stayed with us for a few months, and the Lord used that time to open my eyes that things were getting worse. So I started back to Al-Anon and went to counseling. And over the next 8 months, I started seeing what was really going on in our relationship, because I was stuffing my feelings and really not wanting to look at the truth of things because it hurt so bad. And I learned the cycle of abuse, which explained sometimes it was okay. So it's like, oh, it's going to be okay now. But then it would start all over again. And so I tried to tell him, what he was doing that was hurting me, and he just, oh, you're too sensitive, or just get angry with me. So I read the Psalms daily, and one psalm really stuck out in my mind. My soul has dwelt too long with one who hates peace. I'm for peace, but when I speak, they are for war. And I realized that I just felt like I was in a war zone. So after an unprovoked verbal attack, soon after that, I made plans to leave while he was out of town. And that was one of the hardest, saddest things that I'd ever done, but I had to do it for my health and my safety, because I was just dying inside. I was not able to be free to be myself. So in the last 15 months, I've been working on my recovery, going to Al-Anon and reading a lot of literature about trauma and abuse and narcissism and recovery. And I have a lot of support from my friends and family also. A couple months ago, after being separated for a year, my husband hadn't really been taking any responsibility for anything he'd done, but the Lord just made an opportunity for me to be able to talk with him and tell him with grace and truth this time. And he listened for the first time in many years, and he evidently didn't realize the damage, the extent of the damage that he caused. And he's getting some help. I don't know what's going to happen with us. I'm just putting my hope in the Lord and not in my husband and not in my marriage. And looking back over my life and the years of pain, I've just learned how to be aware of what's happened, but I don't condemn myself anymore. I recognize that God has forgiven me, and so I forgive myself, and I accept that I did the best I could at the time. And I know God's been with me through it all, loving me and drawing me to himself, because he's the God of my life. Thank you.